The scent of polished cherry wood and aged whiskey hung heavy in the library, a perfume of inherited power that Eleanor Vance had inhaled daily for 40 years. Now, that power was suffocating her. Arthur, her husband, stood before the immense bay window, the Chicago skyline a muted backdrop to his triumph. "June 1st, 2025, he stated, tapping the crystal glass in his hand, the brittle sound echoing the tension in the room. "The 40th anniversary of the bet, Eleanor. 40 years since I wagered you couldn't survive our life together without cracking, and look at you, you're still standing. Barely." Eleanor gripped the leather armchair, her knuckles white. She had 2 envelopes in her lap. One contained the signed deed to the Vance Family Trust, securing her financial independence and artistic legacy, the prize for her victory. The other held the letter of separation, a public document that would confirm Arthur's cruel prediction and shatter the pristine image they had built for their children, the high price of her personal freedom. She had to choose freedom and public disgrace, or silence and the golden cage. Her entire life had been governed by the relentless internal mandate: undue loyalty. It was this fatal flaw, this need to honor every promise, especially the destructive ones, that had kept her subservient to Arthur's psychological games since 1985. The choice was a betrayal of either herself or the reputation she had spent 4 decades painstakingly crafting. Arthur smiled, a viper satisfied by its venom. "The deadline is approaching, Ellie. 48 hours. Until the gala where we announce your survival or your surrender. Make your move." Eleanor tasted the metallic fear on her tongue. The bet wasn't about love. It was about Arthur proving that she was merely a component in his perfect, polished life, a trophy wife who could endure his coldness. Her choice, he knew, would define not only her future, but the public memory of their dynasty. The clock was ticking, and the fear that her undue loyalty would paralyze her choice was almost as painful as Arthur's cruelty. She had survived Arthur's games before, but this final test felt like a tightrope walk over 40 years of accumulated secrets, each step an earthquake waiting to happen. Eleanor pushed herself up from the chair, the heavy brocade upholstery releasing a faint, dusty scent as she moved. She didn't look at Arthur, fixing her gaze instead on the rain streaking the glass, turning the lights of the United States city into smeared watercolor. 48 hours. 2 sunrises until the inevitable confrontation at the celebratory gala, which Arthur, with characteristic grandiosity, had named the Perseverance of Partnership. He delighted in the irony. Her first task was to assess the damage. She walked to the gallery adjoining the library where her own art, bold, tormented abstract expressionism, was hidden behind heavy velvet curtains. Arthur called it decorative eccentricity. She touched the rough canvas of her favorite piece, the Gilded Cage. The thick impasto paint felt cold and solid, a silent scream she'd captured years ago. Her art was the single fragile thing Arthur could not control, yet her undue loyalty had prevented her from displaying it publicly, fearful of generating the scandal he craved. The main issue, however, was their youngest daughter, Clarissa. Clarissa, unlike her siblings, hadn't yet been completely absorbed into the Vance machine. She was an aspiring journalist, fiercely dedicated to truth, the very element Eleanor was about to ignite or extinguish. If Eleanor chose freedom, the separation letter would become front-page news, ruining the family's carefully manufactured image of enduring commitment, the image Clarissa desperately needed to leverage for her own career launch. Later that evening, the smell of expensive French wine pervaded the grand dining room. Arthur was on a call, discussing mergers. Eleanor watched Clarissa pick at her poached salmon, her shoulders tight with professional anxiety. "I've been offered the lead story for the Globe," Clarissa announced, her voice trembling slightly. "It's a profile on enduring power couples. They want to interview you and Dad about the secret to lasting 40 years. Eleanor's hands tightened around her silverware, her stomach clenching. Her loyalty demanded she protect Clarissa's future, even if it meant sacrificing her own. The silence of the vast, echoing room was a heavy blanket, muffling the plea she wanted to scream. "Don't build your life on my lie." The aroma of Arthur's imported cigar smoke followed Eleanor into the conservatory the next morning. Only 24 hours remained until the gala. Her failure to act quickly had already set the first obstacle in motion. Clarissa was downstairs preparing for the interview, the questions already vetted and approved by Arthur's PR team, a sanitized testament to their perfect marriage. Eleanor realized she couldn't sign the separation letter without undermining Clarissa's journalistic credibility and potentially sinking her big break. Her undue loyalty to the family image, even one built on deceit, was overriding her desperate need for freedom. The choice felt like a suffocating silk scarf tightening around her throat. Obstacle 1. The challenge of competence. She needed to retrieve the original, unvetted interview questions Clarissa had prepared, the ones that might reveal the cracks in their facade prematurely, giving Eleanor a controlled chance to confess the truth to her daughter privately before the public announcement. She found Clarissa's laptop on the antique writing desk in her room, amidst a scattering of notes and printed articles highlighting the prestige of the Vance name in the United States financial sector. The keyboard was cool beneath Eleanor's fingertips. A small, dry leaf from a Chicago oak tree was pressed between 2 pages of Clarissa's journal. Eleanor hesitated, the faint, earthy scent a stark contrast to the sterile opulence of the room. She was about to invade her daughter's privacy, an action that grated against every instinct cultivated by her fatal flaw. Eleanor opened the file. The original questions were sharp, penetrating. What is the cost of maintaining a dynasty? And, did you ever consider quitting? These questions were far more honest than the boilerplate Arthur had approved. She printed them quickly, the soft whir of the printer a loud, nerve-wracking sound in the quiet house. She replaced the laptop exactly as she found it, her heart hammering against her ribs. She was taking control, but the taste of deceit was bitter. It was easier to face Arthur's manipulation than the potential disappointment in her daughter's eyes. Eleanor waited until mid-afternoon, the sun casting long, sterile rectangles across the imported marble floor. The house staff was busy setting up for the gala, the distant muffled clinking of crystal glasses a constant reminder of the fast-approaching deadline. She needed a private conversation with Clarissa. She found her daughter in the sunroom, reviewing the approved script. "Clarissa, a moment," Eleanor murmured, her voice tight. She laid the original, honest questions on the glass table. The heavy, expensive paper felt oddly rough under her finger. The scent of ozone from the air conditioning filled the room, cold and unnatural. Clarissa's eyes, wide and startled, darted from the printed sheets to her mother. "These were your real questions, weren't they?" Eleanor asked. Clarissa's shoulders slumped. "Yes, but Dad's team said they were too aggressive, too personal. They want the fairy tale." She ran a hand through her hair, the movement jerky. "Mom, this profile is crucial. It's my launch. I need the Vance endorsement in the United States media." Eleanor knelt beside her daughter's chair. Her fatal flaw, undue loyalty, was a physical ache now. She saw the fragile ambition in Clarissa's face. She knew Arthur was leveraging this dependency. "The fairy tale is a lie, sweetie, and building your career on a lie will rot your foundation." She wanted to protect her daughter from the rot, but her desire to confess the truth was fighting a losing battle against the loyalty she felt to her child's immediate success. "If I sign the separation papers, tomorrow's headline will be explosive," Eleanor said, keeping her voice low, the confession tasting like ash. "It will ruin this profile. It will ruin the narrative of the perseverance of partnership. Can you handle that? Can your career take that hit?" Clarissa's hands began to tremble, her journalistic curiosity warring with her ingrained loyalty to the family's wealth and status. This complex entanglement of ambition and expectation thickened the atmosphere, making the air heavy and hard to breathe. Clarissa pushed herself away, standing abruptly. The metallic scraping sound of the chair on the marble floor was sharp and loud. "Ruin it? Mom, if you leave now, they'll say I manufactured the story, that I was desperate to clean up the family name. My first big break will be tainted by your drama." She paced, her movements mirroring Arthur's nervous energy. "You waited 40 years for this. Why now, right when I need the stability?" This was obstacle 2, the dilemma moral. Eleanor had to choose between her fundamental right to freedom and the immediate, tangible future of her daughter. Her undue loyalty screamed that she must sacrifice her freedom for Clarissa's success. "It's not drama, it's truth," Eleanor pleaded, her throat aching. "It's about Arthur's bet, that I couldn't survive 40 years without breaking. And the only way I win is by leaving with my own money, which I secured by signing that deed." She gestured toward her purse, where the envelopes lay heavy. "Then sign the deed, but don't submit the separation letter until after my piece runs," Clarissa insisted, her tone hardening into negotiation. "Just give me 1 week of the illusion, Mom. 1 week." Eleanor stared at the deed, the guarantee of her independence in the tri-dart United States financial markets. If she waited a week, Arthur could find a loophole, or worse, use the time to manipulate Clarissa further. But her loyalty to her daughter was a vice. She had to choose the illusion of stability over her immediate survival. She nodded slowly, the motion a physical concession. Reversion 1, the compromise. Eleanor tore the separation letter into 4 neat pieces and dropped them into the waste bin. 1 week, she whispered, the defeat stinging her eyes. She signed only the deed, securing the trust. Arthur had predicted she couldn't survive without breaking. She had just broken her promise to herself to leave immediately, all for her daughter. She had bought Clarissa a week of illusion, but she had handed Arthur 7 days to maneuver. The consequence of reversion 1 was immediate. Arthur, sensing her hesitation and lacking the separation document, increased the pressure. He scheduled a private dinner with Clarissa that evening, hours before the gala, clearly intending to reinforce the perfect marriage narrative, or perhaps subtly ensure Clarissa's continued loyalty to him. The smell of roasted duck and truffle oil wafted from the dining room as Eleanor stood outside the closed oak doors. 12 hours. Until the gala. She pressed her ear to the heavy wood, catching muffled snippets of their conversation. Arthur's voice was smooth, persuasive, weaving a narrative of family legacy and the importance of public perception for the Vance name throughout the United States. Your mother has always prioritized stability, Clarissa, Arthur was saying, the words sharp even through the wood. A woman needs protection, especially in these volatile times. That is the secret to 40 years. Knowing your place. Eleanor bit the inside of her cheek until she tasted blood. She could practically feel the threads of Arthur's manipulation weaving around Clarissa, tightening the knot of dependency. Eleanor's undue loyalty had forced her into inaction, and now Arthur was seizing the advantage, framing her desire for freedom as emotional weakness. Every minute she delayed telling the full truth allowed Arthur to redefine reality for their child. She walked back to her private gallery, tearing open the velvet curtains. The heavy fabric felt rough, almost abrasive against her skin. She needed to look at the gilded cage again to remember the truth she was fighting for. She ran her fingers over the scars in the paint, the texture thick and raised. She realized then that her loyalty was being weaponized. It wasn't protecting Clarissa, it was protecting Arthur's lie. She had to expose the source of the betrayal, not just the betrayal itself. Eleanor spent the late hours of the night in her studio, the cold smell of turpentine stinging her nostrils. She wasn't painting, she was dismantling. She had to shift her focus from passive survival, winning the bet and the trust money, to active confrontation, exposing Arthur's manipulation of the bet itself. Her undue loyalty had always centered on keeping the family together, but now she had to use that loyalty to protect Clarissa from the rot, even if it meant tearing the structure down. Superation and growth. Eleanor stopped worrying about the public scandal. Her personal freedom was secured by the trust deed. Her goal shifted to Clarissa's moral clarity. She decided the only way to inoculate Clarissa against Arthur's influence was to show her physical proof of the bet's true nature. She went to Arthur's locked safe hidden behind a bookshelf. She knew the combination, Arthur's first investment banking date, a date he frequently bragged about. The heavy steel door sighed open, releasing a faint smell of old paper and leather. Inside, amongst stock certificates and antique coins, was a manila folder marked simply 1985I. She pulled out the original notarized bet document, the one she had never been allowed to fully read. Her hand shook as she unfolded the brittle parchment. The contract stipulated the terms, Eleanor Vance to endure the marriage for 40 years, maintaining the image of partnership. Should she request separation, Arthur wins. Should she remain by the deadline, Eleanor wins the trust. She remembered the rush of signing it, young and foolish, believing it was a romantic challenge rather than a cage. But beneath the main text, in Arthur's neat, arrogant script, was an amendment, initialed only by him, a detail she had missed 4 decades ago. If the family's public standing in the United States media suffers a verifiable loss due to Eleanor's actions within 72 hours of the deadline, Arthur retains veto power over the trust payout. This was it. Arthur hadn't bet on her survival. He had bet on her undue loyalty paralyzing her choice. He knew she would never risk the family name. Obstacle 3. The crisis maximum. The amendment meant that if Eleanor filed for divorce now, the media storm would give Arthur the right to block her inheritance. Her undue loyalty, which led her to compromise with Clarissa and delay the divorce, had activated Arthur's final trap. She had won the trust money by staying, but was prevented from claiming it by causing a scandal. She was effectively trapped. 6 hours remained. The only way to win was to accept the inevitability of the public loss, but ensure the narrative surrounding that loss was Eleanor's, not Arthur's. She had to use her betrayal against her. She marched to the library, where Arthur was meeting with his lawyer, the smell of expensive leather-bound books and fresh coffee mingling sharply in the morning air. Eleanor burst in without knocking. Arthur, immaculately dressed in his tuxedo for the morning preparations, looked up, a satisfied smirk playing on his lips. "Ellie, my dear, ready for your grand announcement of survival? The gala is almost upon us." Eleanor held up the original bet document, pointing a shaking finger at the veto clause. You knew my loyalty to the image would paralyze me." Arthur shrugged, adjusting his cufflink. "It was simply good foresight. You can't win the bet and retain your freedom, Eleanor. That was the game. You're wealthy now, but you're still mine. The family image remains intact." The lawyer cleared his throat, confirming the legality of the clause without needing to speak a word. Eleanor looked at the document, feeling the coarse texture of the old paper crumple slightly in her grasp. The betrayal wasn't Arthur's trickery. It was her own unwavering, detrimental loyalty that had always prioritized image over truth. She finally saw the true cost of her fatal flaw. She had lost. She stood in the sterile silence of the grand room, the Chicago sun glare reflecting painfully off the polished mahogany, realizing that the only thing she had left to protect was the truth for Clarissa. The night dark of the soul settled upon Eleanor in the frantic hours leading up to the gala. She retreated to her studio, not for painting, but for pure, desperate strategizing. The smell of fresh lilies, a bouquet Arthur had sent as a final, patronizing gesture, was sickeningly sweet. She ran a hand over the thick, rough canvas of the gilded cage. "Arthur wins if I cause a scandal that damages the family's public standing in the United States media within 72 hours of the deadline." Her vision blurred. She had sacrificed 40 years, sacrificed her own identity, all in the name of loyalty to a lie. Now, if she tried to claim her freedom, Arthur would use that same loyalty to strip her of the money. She realized that the undue loyalty wasn't just to the family image, but to Arthur's definition of it. The silence of the studio was broken only by the distant, rhythmic hum of the building's massive HVAC system. A profound, sickening clarity washed over her. She couldn't fight Arthur's legal trap with legal maneuvers. She had to fight it with a moral explosion. If she couldn't file for divorce, she could certainly ensure that Arthur's victory felt like a defeat. She looked at the painting, her eyes fixed on the areas where the gold leaf was thickest, trapping the dark reds beneath. She grasped the palette knife. A sharp, cool sliver of steel. Instead of using it on a fresh canvas, she walked to the gilded cage and began to scrape. The sound was a grating, tear of paint on canvas, a violent, desperate noise. She wasn't destroying her work. She was modifying it. She was integrating the truth of the bet into the art itself. A message meant for one person, Clarissa. She would use the gala, Arthur's stage, to stage her final quiet insurrection. She was done protecting the lie. Climax. The grand ballroom of the Vance estate throbbed with the sound of a string quartet and the murmur of Chicago's elite. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm, deceptive glow over the hundreds of guests, Arthur's carefully cultivated audience. The deadline was imminent. 11:58 p.m. 4 minutes remained. Eleanor stood beside Arthur on the dais, wearing a silk gown that felt like a shroud. The crowd's anticipation was a palpable, suffocating pressure. Arthur smiled, leaning into the microphone, the sound of his breath a sudden loud rush. 40 years, he announced, his voice booming with false magnanimity. My Eleanor has survived every challenge, proving that true partnership in the United States requires true perseverance. He reached for her hand, his grip possessive. Eleanor pulled away slightly, turning toward the massive blank wall behind the dais. Before the final toast, she said, her voice quiet but amplified, I have one small announcement. Arthur's eyes narrowed, but before he could intervene, 2 of the hired gallery staff, who Eleanor had bribed earlier, pulled a thick black sheet from the wall. Behind it wasn't the expected Vance crest, but Eleanor's notorious painting, The Gilded Cage. The crowd gasped. The heavy dark painting was raw and jarring amongst the polished decor. The scent of fresh, still wet paint applied hours ago hit the front rows. But it was the additions that drew all eyes. Scrawled across the gold leaf, Eleanor had painted in thick, crude red the exact terms of Arthur's bet, complete with the veto clause. Below it, she'd added a simple, undeniable statement. I won the money. He won the cage. The string quartet faltered, the high notes dying out in the suffocating silence. Clarissa, standing directly below the dais, saw the writing first. Her breath hitched, a faint, ragged sound. Arthur stared, his face draining of color, the triumphant look dissolving into murderous fury. He opened his mouth to deny it, but Eleanor was faster. She leaned into the microphone, the metallic taste of adrenaline sharp in her mouth. "Arthur bet on my undue loyalty," she announced, her voice cracking with the strain of 40 years of silence. "And I allowed him to win. But the bet wasn't about our love. It was about his control. Tonight I give him his victory. But I keep the truth." Reversion 2. The final move. Arthur lunged for the microphone, his polished veneer shattering. "She's unstable. A smear campaign. This is exactly the public damage that voids the trust." He gestured wildly at the painting, his voice a frantic roar. The flashbulbs from the journalist Clarissa had invited, who now realized they were witnessing the real story, were blinding. Eleanor remained calm, her hands flat against the mahogany podium, grounding herself against the chaos. She looked directly at Clarissa, whose face was a mask of disbelief and horror, seeing 40 years of manufactured history collapse in a single painful moment. "Arthur is right," Eleanor stated clearly, the noise in the ballroom instantly quieting, a collective intake of breath audible. "This spectacle does damage the Vance reputation in the broad United States. Therefore, according to the terms he set, he retains the veto power over the trust. He wins the bet and keeps the money." A murmur of confusion swept through the room. Why would she publicly concede defeat? Arthur stood stunned, his jaw hanging open, the realization of her strategy dawning on him. The revelation. Eleanor reached into her pocket and pulled out a key, not to the trust vault, but to the gallery. "The money was never the prize, Arthur. The prize was the proof." She stepped back and pointed to the wall adjacent to the gilded cage. "The separation papers I tore up yesterday? They were a decoy. Clarissa, your original, unedited, honest interview questions? I sent those to the Globe 3 hours ago. Not as an interview, but as a sworn affidavit detailing the bet, the veto, and the decades of emotional abuse." She had willingly forfeited the wealth, sacrificing her own victory for a public truth that Clarissa could build her career upon, a truth that Arthur could never control. "I didn't file for separation," Eleanor declared, the sound of her voice raw with finality. "But I have just given Clarissa the story of the century, confirmed by the evidence painted on that wall. You retain the trust, Arthur, but I retain the narrative, and more importantly, I finally free my daughter from the lie." The aftermath was a brutal, beautiful silence punctuated by the furious, strangled cry Arthur let out as he realized his absolute public ruin. Eleanor stepped down from the dais, ignoring the stampede of media converging on Arthur. The air was thick with the scent of fear and ozone from the flashbulbs. Costo da Vittoria. Eleanor won the only battle that mattered: moral clarity and Clarissa's future. Clarissa, pale but composed, met her mother's eyes, not with anger over the initial deception, but with the cold, assessing gaze of a journalist who had just been handed the most explosive story of the year in the United States. The immediate public collapse of the Vance dynasty, fueled by Eleanor's confession and Arthur's visible panic, was the verifiable public damage that guaranteed Arthur kept the trust money. Eleanor had won her freedom, but at the cost of the fortune she had earned. Later that week, Eleanor left the house with only one suitcase and the heavy, custom-built canvas, the gilded cage, now bearing the scars of truth. The permanent loss was not the wealth. It was the final, irreversible rift with the rest of her children, who, too dependent on Arthur's money and status, refused to believe their father was capable of such prolonged cruelty, interpreting Eleanor's move as selfish destruction. The rough texture of the suitcase handle beneath her fingers was the only comfort she found in the silence of the waiting town car. Driving away, she looked back at the sprawling estate, the symbol of her 40 years of undue loyalty. She hadn't broken the terms of the bet. She had merely revealed them. She lost the money but gained an artistic career, launching her newly truthful work internationally, finally free from Arthur's suffocating judgment. Clarissa's article, "The Price of Perseverance: How Undue Loyalty Became a Cage," won a Pulitzer. Eleanor's final move had stunned the family and the world. She sacrificed the cage to ensure the bird finally learned to fly, even if she flew away penniless. The victory was immense. The loneliness, absolute.